All right, so now we're going to get into the details of the sense organ of the eyes. So here's a picture of the eye, an actual picture of an eye on the left. So that small, bright sort of orb you see is where the pupil is located, and that's where the light comes in. And we're going to talk briefly about each part of the eye that you see listed on the picture on the right and its purpose. So first we have the cornea. Oh, I apologize. This slide, the animations are a little off, but the cornea is a transparent and protective layer that is around the front of the eye. And because of its curved shape, it refracts or bends the incoming light and focuses the light more sharply. The pupil is the dark hole that appears in the middle of the iris. So the size of the pupil changes, it retracts and expands depending on how much light is present in your environment. So the brighter the light is, or the brighter the light is in your environment, the smaller the pupil gets to sort of block out too much light. However, the darker it is, or the less light there is in the environment, the larger the pupil gets. So it expands to let more light in. Now, you might wonder, well, why don't our pupils just stay enlarged all the time and let in the most light it can to see better? And the reason is that the expansion of the pupil, so when it expands in the dark to let more light in, it does allow us to see more, objects in the dark. But with that wide open pupil, it's actually harder for us to discern range of distance of objects. So our depth perception is really off. A good example of this, if you've ever been on a night hike with very little or no flashlights or lamps, you're sort of just hiking by moonlight. You'll notice that although the moonlight is enough to see by, like you can see that there are trees and there are bushes and you can see where the path is, your pupils are widely expanded, trying to let as much light in as possible. And everything on the ground almost looks flat or like two-dimensional. So rocks and sticks or anything that's sort of sticking up out of the ground actually looks flat. It all looks at the same level. So your depth perception is really off. And often you trip on these rocks or sticks or anything sticking out of the ground because when you look down at them, they actually all look flat. It's an interesting thing if you've ever done a night hike or if you've ever been out walking, a curb even will not look as raised as you think it is. So when you raise your foot, you might trip on it because you didn't raise your foot high enough. So your depth perception is really off in the dark with a wide open pupil. Next, we have the iris, and this is just the colored part of the eye, and this surrounds the pupil. Now, once light passes through the pupil, it enters the lens of the eye. This is located directly behind the pupil, and the lens also reflects light to be better focused once it reaches the retina. So the light is focused by the lens actually changing in thickness itself. So this is called accommodation. So as the lens becomes flatter or thinner when viewing more distant objects, and it becomes rounder or thicker when viewing objects close up. And then finally, the light reaches the retina. So the retina converts the electromagnetic energy of light to electrical impulses that neurons can then carry as messages to your brain through the optic nerve, which we'll talk about in a minute. The retina consists of a thin layer of nerve cells, so it's at the back of the eye here. And these nerve cells are made up of two kinds of light sensitive receptor cells. They're made up of rods and cones. So there's nerve cells on the back of that retina, and those nerve cells are made up of rods and cones. So rods are thin cylindrical receptor cells that are highly sensitive to light and are mainly used in peripheral vision. So objects that you observe, but they're sort of outside of your main center of focus. And rods are also used in night vision. And then we have cones, which are cone-shaped receptor cells and are concentrated in a specific part of the retina known as the fovea. These are light sensitive as well, but they are responsible for sharp or main focus as well as color perception. Now, the retina contains about 100 million rods and 7 million cones. So there are more rods than cones. And depending on whether the incoming light encounters a rod or cone, determines what then will happen with that light energy. So, whichever it comes in contact with, something's going to happen to that light, depending on whether it comes in contact with a rod or with a cone. So, if the light encounters rods, it produces the chemical called rhodopsin. And in cones, these chemicals are just called color pigments, right? Because the cones are associated with color perception. In both cases, these stimulations of either the rods or the cones are going to produce some chemical that's then transmitted to other nerve cells in the retina. So it's sort of this multi-step process, right? The light comes in, hits the retina. It's either going to contact the rods or the cones, which is going to release a certain chemical. And then those chemicals are transmitted to other nerve cells in the retina. First, they go to the bipolar cells and then the ganglion cells. So the bipolar cells receive information from the rods and cones and then transmits this information to the ganglion cells. And then the ganglion cells collect this information and send it to the brain through the optic nerve. So you have this multi-step process happening as the light is entering the eye. Now here is sort of a blown up image of what this process looks like. So as the light comes in and hits the retina, the back of the eye, where the rods and cones are contained, it triggers a reaction. This chemical reaction then activates the bipolar cells and ganglion cells, right? So bipolar cells first, it transmits that information from the rods and cones, passes it on to the ganglion cells, and then they transfer that information to the brain through the optic nerve. Now, as this information is being processed through the optic nerve, it doesn't just go straight to the brain. It actually travels to a point where the optic nerve from each eye meets in the middle, approximately right between your eyes. And this is known as the optic chiasm. And here, the optic nerve cells split. So any nerve impulses that came from your right eye are actually sent to the left side of your brain. And any impulses that came from your left eye are sent to the right side of your brain. Okay, so they go through the optic nerve of each eye, they cross in the middle, and then they go to the opposite sides of the brain. So the right eye information goes to the left eye information goes to the right. Now, by the time the message or information from the visual stimuli actually reaches your brain, as we've talked about, it already passes through several stages of processing through the eye. And the outcome of these stages of processing result in providing the brain with an enhanced version of the actual visual stimulus that is observed in the environment. But the most complex processing takes place in the visual cortex of the brain. And there are what are called feature detectors, which are specialized neurons that are in parts of the brain that are only activated by visual stimuli that have very specific features. So features like certain shapes, certain patterns, certain orientations. These feature detectors are all specific to different features of the stimulus. So for example, some feature detectors are only activated by lines that have a certain width or shape. But then there are different feature directors in the visual cortex that are only activated by moving stimuli rather than stationary stimuli, right? And there are other feature detectors that are only activated by stationary stimuli instead of moving stimuli, and so on and so forth. So these feature detectors are these specialized neurons that are only activated when a specific feature of an object, that information is brought to the brain. Now, a person with normal color vision is able to see the full spectrum of colors from violet blue to red. Okay, when we were talking about the visual spectrum, most people can see all those colors. And thus, they have three kinds of cones in the retina, with each cone responding to a specific range of wavelength. So, there are three according to the trichromatic theory. They are blue violet, green, and yellow red. So the trichromatic theory states that our perception of color is influenced by the relative strength of which each of these cones is activated. So what that's saying is that if you see a certain color, a certain colored cone is activated, and that's why you see that color, because that cone's activated and the other cones are not. So if you see a blue sky, for example, then the blue violet cones are mainly activated, right? While the green and yellow red cones are less active. However, there are some things that we observe visually and through the visual process that this theory doesn't really explain very well. So, for example, if you were to stare at a flag with these colors on them, if it had black and green stripes and yellow surrounding black stars, if you stare at this for a very long time and then immediately after stare at a white piece of paper, you will actually see an image of a traditional colored flag. You'll see red and white stripes where there was green and black, and you'll see blue with white stars where there was yellow and black stars. You should actually try this. It's a really cool visual process. It's kind of a trip, but it's really neat. There's an image of the inverted color flag in your book. And if you stare at that for at least 1 minute and then hold up a white piece of paper and sort of let your eyes go out of focus a little bit, you'll actually see the traditional red, white, and blue American flag. So why does this happen? The opponent process theory offers a different explanation for how we perceive color. So this theory suggests that receptor cells are actually linked in pairs and are working in opposition to each other. So specifically, this proposes that there's a blue-yellow pair, a red-green pair, and a black and white pair. So basically, if the object reflects more of one color, then it stimulates the cells sensitive to that color. And conversely, it inhibits cells sensitive to the opposite color. So for example, if an object reflects more blue than yellow, it stimulates those cells sensitive to blue and then inhibits those cells sensitive to yellow, and vice versa. So now the question is, does this explain that sort of after image that you get when you stare at certain colors and then you look at a blank page and you actually see different colors or the opposite colors? And it does provide some explanation. So after staring at a certain color for a long period of time, those receptor cells become very fatigued and you become less and less able to respond to them. So if you're staring at yellow for a long period of time, those receptor cells at first, they're activated, right? You see yellow, but over time, those receptors become fatigued. And it's a pair receptor cell. Um, those paired receptor cell colors, so yellow is paired with blue, those cells are not fatigued, right? Because you've been staring at yellow, those become fatigued, but blue is not and will actually become stimulated. This is why you see the opposite color blue after staring at yellow. And we can go through this with each of the pairings with red and green and with black and white as well. So that explains why you can look at a flag that's green, black, and yellow for a long period of time. And then later you actually see the red, white, and blue flag. Although this theory seems to explain more than the trichromatic theory of color, both of these theories are actually accurate. They're just describing different processes, but both of those processes are actually taking place. So the trichromatic processes that are explained by the trichromatic theory, they take place within the retina itself, while the opponent processes operate both within the retina and at later stage of neuronal processing. So these processes that these theories explain are both taking place just in different areas of the eye. Now, there are some individuals who are unable to discern certain colors from others. So, color blindness refers to one's decreased ability to see color or see differences in color. Approximately 7% of men experience color blindness, while about 0.4% of women experience this. For most with color blindness, their visual world lacks some sort of contrast or it appears sort of dull. So, for example, all red and green objects might appear to be yellow. So, if you think about traffic lights for an individual with this particular color blindness, everything would look yellow. They're unable to discern the difference between the three. Other forms of color blindness include not being able to discern between blue and yellow, and very extreme, and these are rare cases of individuals don't see any color at all. So they actually only see in shades of black and white. Another interesting phenomenon we see with vision occurs with visual illusions. So these are physical stimuli that consistently produce errors in our perception. And we make these mistakes or errors even if we are aware that it is in fact an illusion. To the right, you see an image of a molar liar illusion. So this consists of two stylized lines, which because of the way the ends are facing, you see that on the top, the arrows are like out, facing in. And on the bottom line, the arrows are facing out, right? It makes the center line appear to be different lengths, right? Even though in actuality, that center line is the exact same length. If you were to take the arrows off of both of those ends, of both the top and bottom line, you would see that that center line is actually the same length. But it does appear that the top one is longer and the bottom one is shorter. And people do often make this mistake when they're looking at this sort of illusion. And the next few slides you'll see, you can go through these on your own, but they contain other visual illusions that I've included for you to observe just for fun.